Okay, so implantation of the blastocyst occurs in the uterus. And more specifically, in the lining of the endometrium. So the blastocyst, remember, is first in that fertilization membrane, and it has to break free of the fertilization membrane, and then it floats around a little bit until it will adhere to the lining of the uterus. That adhering will cause the trophoblast to start to produce digestive enzymes. So the trophoblast produces digestive enzymes. Interestingly, when we look at this process, it actually is almost like a parasitic invasion of the uterus. So this actually causes inflammation in the uterus. So this causes the inflammatory response, which remember is this response that is related to the immune system. So inflammation leads to histamine being released. It leads to the blood vessels becoming leaky. And so that fluid will actually leak out of the blood vessels. And then you get actually cells coming in and thinking that there has been a breach of the body by a foreign body. So this inflammatory response is interesting, and it actually creates this environment where the embryo is actually able to move deeper into the lining, and then eventually that lining forms kind of like a cyst over the embryo, and then the embryo is fully implanted. So let's look at some images that show this process of implantation. So the first image here shows the blastocyst, and it is going to break free from that zona pellucida, and it is going to move around a little bit, float around in the lining, or excuse me, in the uterus before it finds a proper place to adhere. And there are proteins that allow that embryo to adhere to the lining. And then we get the trophoblast releasing enzymes, and it's starting to become embedded in the lining. So the trophoblast actually forms into two different structures. So the cytotrophoblast, which you do need to know this word, you'll just remember that the cytotrophoblast is going to, the cells are going to remain distinguished from each other. So the cells have a plasma membrane surrounding the nuclei, and they remain distinct from one another. So that's why it's called the cytotrophoblast. The cytotrophoblast, syn means coming together. And so this is where the plasma membrane actually kind of degenerates, and then you have these nuclei. And so it allows for these finger-like extensions to be embedded into the lining of the endometrium. And the endometrium, remember, is vascular and glandular. So it is going to actually need to feed the developing embryo early on prior to the development of the placenta. So if we look at another diagram here, we can see that this embryo is actually going to become, oops, what happened to my diagram? This embryo is actually going to become differentiated. So some of the cells are going to differentiate into the epiblast. The epiblast is going to become the embryo, the embryonic disc, as well as the amniotic membrane, so the amnion. And then we have the hypoblast right here, which is in yellow, and that is going to become the yolk sac. So yes, we do have a yolk sac early on, and that yolk sac actually becomes part of the umbilical cord. And so that early on during embryonic development, we see cell differentiation. So that cell differentiation is super important, and it's due to differences in gene regulation. So how genes are turned on and turned off in different cells are going to determine the fate of that of those cells in the developing embryo.